Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about API design. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, in a situation at work, is there a point to a complex REST backend to make a generic service that encapsulate DAO, ORM, and also mapper? The problem I see is that this is very hard to modify, and in the future it might become unmaintainable. What is a good practice from your experience with services, DAOs, etc.? Well, that is much too generic. I don't even know where you start, honestly, with this question, because like you claim that this can be hard to maintain in the future, and I kind of go, what stack are you working in? Because basically every web server that in every single language follows a MVC style of pattern, unless of course like there are absolute exceptions to this rule. Like I mean, an ORM, for example, you don't necessarily need an ORM, but like a mapper, again, like I'm not sure why my mind is telling me that you might be working in C sharp or something like that, because damn the people in C sharp for loving their mappers, automapper, and all this bullshit that I truly despise working with. But like, if we just back it up a little bit, so in general, you have in every single API a DAO of some sort, or a data access object, or a model, depending on how you want to define it. You have something that represents your connection from the application server to the database data, and some way, depending on how you do it. There are many ways of doing this. Like an ORM would be an example of how you get the data from the tables, or depending if you're using a document database or whatever you're using, right? But from the database, getting that data into the application server and then mapping it somehow to an object of some sort, usually, or any data structure. We can keep it even looser than that, because I've seen some people who don't like, they use hash maps or like maps for things instead, right? So uh, you can do that in many ways. Like you can build your own like a DAO, or you can just use the raw connection and parse the data out. Like there's just few ways of doing that. But if you work in one of the more like mainstream languages or so forth, you're usually dealing with a library of some sort. Like as I was saying, say C Sharp and Java, like the standards are there. Like unless you're using something like Dapper or something like that, you usually have something like Entity Framework or Hibernate for Java. Like there are a few tastes, depending again on what you're using, right? So what I don't really agree with that this can be unmaintainable, because it's practically standard practice to do this. There are situations where I would not use, say, a ORM or something like that, but and that's one of my favorite use cases for, say, Dapper, when you don't really have an object model. Like if let's say that you're creating like something like Excel sheets or tables or statistics or stuff like that, where you might be querying multiple tables across many different or multiple tables, and like sort of composing data where you don't really have a one-to-one mapping between a table and an object. That's a really nice use case to not use an ORM, in my opinion, because usually then in those situations it's more efficient for you to just write the query yourself. But my rule of thumb when it comes to REST APIs and so forth is that I try to think about REST API, or rather that's what I like to do. So for me, a good REST API is 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 the right choice if you have more than one client. So an example of where I would use a REST API or build a REST API would be when I make a system that needs to be integrated to from other services, for example. A good example of these sorts of things is, the GitHub APIs, Facebook APIs, or Google APIs, and so forth and so forth. The reason why I argue that is because when you do like an RPC style where you might have very specific URL endpoints that do something more business logically, or like where you might mix data and you don't really keep that clean, nice URL pattern that you have on a REST API, that can very quickly get out of hand. It's, I argue, one of the main reasons why REST came to be, or like that pattern, because if the mental picture I have for a REST API is that a REST API is just a thin layer on top of the database. Because if you know REST, you know that most everything is like the categorization of URLs is usually something like /user, /product, /order, or something like that. And then you have a URL pattern that where you can like express an ID of some sort, like these basic things like creating, updating, like the CRUD application, and so forth. And most of the stuff that you want to do, the operations, are expressed through the HTTP method that you're using. And that maps very, very nicely to the query that is going to go into the database later, because it's usually not the case that you use a REST API to do something fairly sophisticated. You're usually just expressing these easy operations like listing, getting, creating, and stuff like that. And I argue that the intention behind that is because when you make a REST API, you don't have to worry about creating very complicated functionality on the server. You can keep the server fairly simple and let the client use multiple calls to basically, you don't give them a raw query to the database, but you expose a piece of the functionality that your database has so that they can compose together their own data set, which is absolutely perfect if you have a lot of clients. Because if you have like a 3, 4, 5, 10 different clients, you don't really know what their business logic is and how they want to consume your API. And so instead of you trying to sit there and make everybody happy, it's better for you to just make something slightly more generic that they can use in order to compose their data and sort of take the performance hit of them having to make multiple calls. However, if you are using a setup where you're basically you have a one-to-one mapping, you have one, say, front-end part of the application, let's say you build a regular monolith or something like that, and you have one backend, then it's not really necessary for you to build a pure REST API, because what you don't have a multi-client situation, so you can tailor the data structure that you send in the responses from the server to the client like absolutely perfectly, so that you can avoid having the client making multiple calls and sort of composing together their own data structure, because you can just do that on the server in one single query, or like a few queries depending on how it works, right? And send the whole batch of data back in exactly the format that the client wants. And that's where I say an RPC type of style is a little bit more appropriate, because as I said, you really don't need to force the client to do more calls, because if you can avoid, that's the thing that is really great with GraphQL, if you ask me, at the very least, where you can sort of have your cake and eat it at the same time, where you can reduce down the work of the client by sending multiple calls to compose together a data structure, which is the case with REST, right? And you can create a query basically that can compose all that data on the server in one batch, which is, again, for performance reasons, much nicer. Yet it is still flexible enough that multiple clients can do that without you having to create like a specific endpoint for a specific client or stuff like that. The one time I like to break the REST rule, or like the REST pattern, even when I'm dealing with multiple clients, is if I have to take an action of some sort. It's not just a query to a database, like getting something or updating something. Like, let's say, for example, that you want to run a batch job, create a report of some sort, or if you're going to send out some emails or something like that. If you look at a few of the big API providers, they usually mix a little bit. They have a lot of REST endpoints for just dealing with the data, but they also have some RPC style of URLs where a REST API doesn't make any sense, because, as I said, the mapping for REST is it's so perfectly expressive when it comes to databases and that sort of stuff, but it falters a little bit, in my opinion, when it comes to other things than just dealing with data. So what I want you to take away from this is that I can't really tell you that I don't agree that something's going to be unmaintainable because you have an ORM or like a service layer or a DAO or things like that. What I usually say is, so if you were going to go super high level here, guys, because I can't really go deeper because the question is so generic. In my personal opinion, at the very least, you don't really need, like, you always need a DAO, like an object model or something that represents a connection to the database. And that is, you can do that in 100 ways. You don't need an ORM for that. My rule of thumb is if you have a very good mapping between the data you need in memory, like in your application server, and a table or a document or something where it's basically a one-to-one mapping, then an ORM is really nice because you don't have to do the parsing yourself. But if you're doing statistics or things where you might have to compose data from multiple tables in order to create like a data structure or like a response to from the API or something like that, then if that is the main thing for your application, then you don't really need an ORM. Then it's probably better to just write the queries out yourself and then manually parse it. Or if you're using mapping library or something like that, that's fine. But you still need the connection somehow. So that's the thing I have to say on that. And when it comes to like services and stuff like that, everybody does it a little bit differently. I usually always have a service layer in all of my application, but I see people put things in controllers, methods, and so like depending on how you define it. That's a whole different video, like what I feel about those sorts of things and so forth. Because we should keep this a little bit brief. And when it comes to REST versus RPC, or how you should generally think about your APIs, in my opinion at the very least, if you have more than one client or a integration type of system where a lot of people are going to connect to your system in order to deal with different data on your system, consider a REST pattern, because it's really, really well suited for more than one client where you don't want to have a specific implementation of everything for each client. However, if you have a one-to-one mapping, you don't really need a REST API because it's more efficient to use a single query and get all the data that the client needs than to have to do multiple ones with a REST API. You can use GraphQL as well if you really want to, but there are pros and cons there as well. I always find that even the best APIs have at least one or two, like a few RPC style of methods on their APIs, so that they can express things that are not just data associated with something in the data in the database, such as sending emails, creating reports, or like triggering alerts or stuff like that. More action-based things. That's usually a good fit for an RPC endpoint. And so knowing your use cases here and using the right amount for the situation is the best way, I argue. Have a great day.